Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. My name is Johanna. I'm from the UN Innovation Network. Welcome to our conversation on the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. Many of you will know that the Secretary General convened a high-level panel on digital cooperation a couple of years ago. And this panel was chaired by Jack Ma from Alibaba and Melinda Gates from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the panel made a series of recommendations to the Secretary General on how to enhance global digital cooperation. Almost a year ago, we actually hosted a webinar on this report and the findings from that report. If you'd like to recap on that, or if you missed the work of the panel, we'll be sharing a link in case you'd like to recap. It's a very good read, very topical still. And since then, and over the course of this year, the team has been following up to translate this report from the high-level panel into an action plan. And this is what our webinar is going to focus on today. Both of the resources, so the report of the high-level panel and the roadmap, are actually really, really excellent reads. And I was just speaking to our presenters saying, you know, the editors have done a tremendously great job on translating at times quite complicated concepts into very simple language. So I would recommend you read them. And they are really more relevant than ever before. And to realize the relevance of this work, we only need to look back to the news of the week, where we had, stories about Twitter being hacked to promote a Bitcoin scam, or there's always reports about cyber meddling in election processes. So the work of the high-level panel on digital cooperation and the follow-up, the roadmap, is more relevant than ever. And I'm really always very pleased to see that the UN is taking such a strong leadership role in this space. As always, we're going to have a presentation up front, and then we are going to allow plenty of time to engage with our speaker. And if you would like to ask any questions, you can see on the next slide, there's a Q&A box on Zoom, and we encourage you to use this Q&A box. You can leave any questions that you have in there. You can also see what other people have asked, and you can give them a like and vote them up to make sure that we prioritize questions that are of most importance to you. Because it tends to be the most popular question, the session is recorded. We are sharing the slides and the recording on the UN Innovation Network website. It'll be available shortly after the webinar there, and you can check it out there. Right, and now let me introduce you to our presenter of the day. Yuping leads the digital cooperation team in the Office of the Special Advisor to the Secretary General, and she specifically looks after the roadmap and the follow-up work from the high-level panel on digital cooperation. Yuping has previously worked for UNOCT, and that is the Office for Counterterrorism, and DPPA, the Political Affairs team, and she's also worked for the Office on Drugs and Crime. And she was previously a representative to the UN, actually, for the Singaporean government, and has worked in various government departments there. So quite a resume, Yuping, and we're thrilled that you could join us today to introduce the roadmap. Before I hand over to you, thank you for coming online. It's always nice to see our presenters. Before I hand over to you, I thought we'd give you a little bit of background on who's on the call today, and I launched a quick poll to find out from people if they have actually read the roadmap for digital cooperation. So launching a quick poll, let's see how informed our audience already is and help you tailor your presentation. Okay, votes coming in. Ooh, there's a quarter of people who are agreeing with me. It's a great read. Nice. Lots of people intending to read it. A couple of people not yet. Leaving the poll open for another couple of seconds, so cast your vote. And here I'm sharing the results. So a majority hasn't read it yet, but you have exactly a quarter who think it's a fantastic read, and about a third who are saying they're looking forward to reading it. So that's the background from our side for you to help you tailor your conversation. And over to you, looking forward to learning more about the roadmap. And you need to unmute, please, Yuping. No, not yet. Let's see, maybe I can help you.
Ah, there we go. Thank you so much, Joanna. And as clearly, I still also have to work out the mute unmute button, which seems to be a feature of our lives these days. Thank you so much to you for inviting me to sort of brief this webinar, and colleagues all from the UN system around listening in. I hope that by the end of my presentation on the roadmap, I'll inspire the 41% who have not read the roadmap plus the 34% who have seen it but have not read it as well, to actually try and read the roadmap. And if not, at least I'll give you a brief summary of what has actually gone on into the publication of the Secretary General's report, this particular roadmap, enough so that you'll have a flavor of what actually our office is doing and the work streams when it comes to digital cooperation. So very quickly, for those who are a little bit less familiar with our work, I work in the office of US Chief Fabrizio Hochschild, as Joanna has mentioned, and we are the ones who have been tasked with the digital cooperation aspects of the follow-up to the high-level panel, which was the process by which the United Nations itself really started on the discussions on digital cooperation. So a little bit of background. What happened was that, starting from a conversation actually between the Secretary General and Kissinger about 3 years back about how the United Nations really needed to start engaging with digital technology and the whole aspect of cyberspace and the digital space a little bit more intensively, the Secretary General actually convened in 2018 his high-level panel on digital cooperation, which was an unprecedented, diverse mix of individual experts. And what was interesting about the high-level panel was that it was not any of the insiders of the UN system, but really it was experts representing different geographies, different fields, scientists, private sector, academics, CSOs, really coming together to think about how we could better use technology and how we could mitigate the challenges of technology itself. And the high-level panel was chaired by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates, and it issued a report, The Age of Digital Interdependence, last July. If you've also, that's another report that perhaps colleagues would want to check out, and I hesitate to run another poll because perhaps the numbers would be even lower than the 25% that read the actual Secretary General's roadmap. But The Age of Digital Interdependence covers a broad range of issues and really gives sort of a landscape, broad view about the state of digital cooperation in the world writ large. And that was issued last July 2019. Following the issuance of the high-level panel's report, the Secretary General then tasked US Chief Fabrizio Hochschild to look at the follow-up to the high-level panel report. The report was very broad, very overarching, but the Secretary General really wanted to see how best we could take forward some of the recommendations in concrete ways. And so to follow up to the panel report, what we then did was we convened 8 thematic roundtables, which are cross-regional multi-stakeholder discussion forums based on the interests indicated by a broad range of stakeholders, be they member states, private sector companies, CSOs, academics, research institutions, technical institutions, to think about what are the areas in the high-level panel report that we really need to take forward and what are the most action-oriented ways that we can do this. So based on this interest, we convened 8 thematic roundtables around the key recommendations of the high-level panel that continued the consultations on how best to take forward the panel's recommendations. The discussions among these thematic roundtables then became the basis for the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. And over the process of the last 9 or 10 months, our office has really been convening these thematic roundtables as well as consulting with other stakeholders as to how, what is the best way that we can take forward the panel's recommendations. And that resulted in the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, which was just launched just last month actually to member states. What is actually interesting is that the Secretary General's roadmap is actually an official document of the General Assembly. It has an official document number, even though technically the high-level panel process and the roadmap consultation process was not a mandated part of the General Assembly. I say this because I think it might be interesting to colleagues in the United Nations system to sort of reflect on this fact that there are Secretary General initiatives that the Secretary General deems as particularly important, which might not necessarily be always officially mandated by a General Assembly process, but because of the importance of the issue can then be presented to the General Assembly and to the member states for the consideration and possibly future work as well. So the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation was launched to member states on 11th of June at a high-level thematic debate of the General Assembly. The President of the General Assembly convened a debate on the impact of rapidly accelerating technologies and the Sustainable Development Goals. The Secretary General was a speaker at this high-level thematic debate, and he took the opportunity to launch his roadmap for digital cooperation. Giving you a quick summary of the content of the roadmap for digital cooperation. Essentially, in the roadmap, the Secretary General follows up on the key recommendations of the high-level panel and then specifically calls on UN member states, private sector, civil society, the technical community, and the global public to support the roadmap, which lays out concrete recommendations to essentially achieve 3 main goals. The 3 main goals would be connect, whereby he calls for everyone to work together to achieve universal, safe, inclusive, and affordable access to the internet for all by 2030. To respect here, we really look at the issue of digital human rights, whereby we say that human rights exist online as they do offline and have to be respected. A lot of the human rights accords were actually written in a time way before we had digital technology and cyberspace. So there is this sort of area in which we're not sure how human rights norms and human rights standards should apply online as well. So the Secretary General's roadmap really calls for this to be front and center in everything that we do. He calls on member states as well as the private sector to really look into how we can protect human rights online as well as we do, as in the same way that we do offline as well. The last aspect of the roadmap is this idea of protection, to protect people online. And this is where I think in the wake of COVID and where we see our dependence on digital technology really sort of increase, that it's something that we really need to think about and engage with as the United Nations. In this time of COVID, we are able to connect online, that we can actually have these virtual meetings and talk and discuss and still work as normal. But at the same time, we're very aware of what the benefits of technology, but also the dangers as well. And so this is where, for instance, online harms such as the harms to children, the cybercrime, the increased use of digital technology for terrorism become an area of online harms that's very critical. And so the issue of protect is this idea of us mitigating online harms for digital technology and rising digital insecurity threats, especially for the most vulnerable among us. I also just want to sort of wrap these three areas, connect, respect, and protect, to say that part of this is also the recognition that, especially now in COVID, where we can realize the benefits of technology, there is still a huge number of people around the world, more than half the population of the world, that is not connected to the internet. And so underpinning this idea of connect, respect, protect is the idea that we also have to increase the ability of everyone around the world to use digital technologies to both connect, but in the process of connecting as well, also making sure that their rights are respected and protected online. So that's the key elements of the Secretary General's roadmap. In those three areas, the Secretary General's roadmap then goes into very detailed, concrete actions to achieve the 8 thematic areas that were highlighted initially by the high-level panel and then brought forward by the consultations, and then in the roadmap itself sort of laid out into very concrete actions and the way forward. So I'll run you through the 8 thematic areas, and I'm really happy to take questions if there are any specific areas that you'd like me to focus a bit more on or to go into sort of the areas that are discussed within the roadmap. The first area is universal connectivity, and I've mentioned this as sort of being really, in some ways, the heart of what we're doing. This idea that there should be access for all and connectivity for all that would then allow us to unlock the benefits of technology. So in the Secretary General's roadmap, he speaks of the actions needed to achieve universal connectivity by 2030. And this is where, for instance, as I've mentioned before, we recognize the fact that almost half of the world's population currently do not have access to internet. And there is actually a very stark digital divide in those who have access and those who don't. So for instance, I believe it's less than 20% of the population in the least developed countries have access to the internet, versus in developed countries where we see something like 80 to 90% having access to broadband and the ability to use it. There's also a very stark digital divide when it comes to gender. In, I think, 2 out of 3 countries in the world, more men than women use the internet. The gender gap overall globally is something like 10%. 48% of women using the internet versus 58%. And again, this gender gap is very much more stark in the least developed and developing countries versus developed countries. So when it comes to digital divides, when it comes to achieving universal connectivity, there is an issue of who is actually accessing and having the ability to use these technologies. And so the Secretary General's roadmap, in laying out this path towards achieving universal connectivity, puts forward very concrete actions. Firstly, agreeing on a baseline of digital connectivity that individuals need to access the online space. This is a little bit like saying, you know, if there is a basic nutritional need, for instance, you need X amount of kilocalories a day to function, what is the basic amount of connectivity, X number of gigabytes, for instance, of data that you would need to meaningfully and usefully use the online space? So that's the idea of the baseline of digital connectivity. Based on this baseline, we then call for the development of connectivity targets and metrics, because as we know in the United Nations, right, if you don't have a target and a way to measure it, then a lot of times action can't be meaningfully taken. So this is where we look for the development of connectivity targets and metrics that will also take into account the fact that there are marginalized groups, there are other risk factors for individuals associated with accessing technology. And we look at how we can best achieve bringing them online and actually measuring their ability to use connectivity. That is also then linked to the second idea, where even if you have a baseline for what we want people to achieve, then we need to think about what the costs are with regards to bringing people online. And this is a recognition that really it's not that cheap to bring people online. For instance, fiber optic cables, broadband cables are actually very expensive, and there's a little bit of a market preference towards establishing them around developed cities or developed or urban areas, which means that, again, conversely, in the most hard to reach places, the market incentive for creating these types of broadband and internet connectivity connections is not high. So that means that there needs to be a push in terms of defining what it means to have an affordable level of internet, and what this means in terms of very concrete aspects, such as what percentage of a monthly income should you peg the cost of broadband connectivity to? How do you define affordability? And even if it's affordable, how do you make sure that those connections are of a good enough quality that the people using the internet can then also use digital tools efficiently? Because even if it's cheap, if the fact is, and if let's say, even if it's cheap and you're just getting like something like 25 megabytes, it's not going to be enough for you to use digital technologies, broadband, and internet in a meaningful way. So that's the notion of defining affordability. And then based on that, we then have to bring together investors and financing experts to actually meet the standard of affordability. The rest of the recommendations for universal affordability are along those lines, where we try to build up the incentive for achieving universal connectivity. So here we look at, for instance, having regional and national connectivity plans, trying to create a regulatory environment that encourages smaller scale internet providers. We look at the use of emerging technologies, for instance. We also specifically call out and actually really, commend the efforts of potentially transformative regional models, as well as like innovative models of connectivity. And here in particular, the International Telecommunications Union and UNICEF have been working on GIGA, which is a project to connect all schools globally to the internet. And this really, in some ways, is transformative, because if you can connect all schools and give all youth and children the opportunity to use the benefits of internet and technology, it really could be a game changer when it comes to education. It could have a knock-on impact for the rest of the societies as well. Finally, we also, in recognition, I think, of what has been the reality of COVID, the Secretary General's roadmap calls for the acceleration of discussions on connectivity as part of emergency responses. And I think this is really where COVID has shown us that, in some ways, connectivity is not something that is something that can be taken for granted, neither is it something that should be seen as a luxury. Where in COVID, it has been access to the internet that has allowed, for instance, first responders to get the most timely information, for the general public to actually receive information about COVID and how best to actually prepare for the situation, and for countries to actually create a more effective response to the virus. So in many ways, connectivity has to be part of the answer to crisis situations and emergencies. And COVID and our experiences here have really sort of brought this to the fore. And this is why, specifically in the Secretary General's roadmap, there is that specific issue about accelerating discussions on connectivity as part of the emergency response. So that's achieving universal connectivity. I spent a little bit more time on this because in many ways, connectivity really will underpin a lot of what we talk about later, the ability to then use digital technologies to their full benefit. The second area that's outlined in the Secretary General's roadmap is this issue of digital public goods. And this was a specific recommendation that was highlighted in the high-level panel. The idea here is that there are digital solutions that, if made open source, can actually help countries, institutions, organizations, the world unlock a more equitable world and help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But there really needs to be a global effort to promote such digital solutions and to make them freely available for all to use. And so here in the Secretary General's roadmap, we stress the need for a global effort to promote, to encourage, to invest in the creation of digital public goods, which we see as open source software, open data, open AI models, standards, and content that can then help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and support a country's development, as well as benefit the society at large. Here we talk about the need for a platform, and this is where, for instance, the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which has been the work of UNICEF working with Norway, Sierra Leone, as well as NGOs, has been really at the foundation of this effort to put forward digital public goods freely for use by all and to encourage the use of digital public goods. We also stress the need for such digital public goods to actually be, to make sure that these promote human rights and that they have robust governance frameworks as well. And overall, it's a call for both the United Nations system as well as member states to really look towards how they can promote the use of digital public goods, and for the United Nations to serve as a platform where, again, these discussions and this encouragement can take place. The third area in the Secretary General's roadmap is digital inclusion. I touched on a little bit of this when I talked about global connectivity, and it is actually quite connected. The idea that if you're trying to ensure connectivity, you need to ensure that the access also is inclusive for all people. So here again, it's this idea that we really need to make sure that connectivity and technologies also reach migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, older persons, young people, and really all the communities that the United Nations has really been set up to serve, those that are marginalized, disadvantaged, really ensuring that the benefits of technology and connectivity, internet, the digital space reach all, and that we close digital divides in terms of access and the ability to use such technologies. So here, for instance, the Secretary General lays out a number of key actions again to allow for better matrix, develop data collection, as well as the coordination of inclusion initiatives. There has been a lot of work done by many parts of the UN system, and I'm sure many of you in this area of digital inclusion. But the idea is that if we can bring them together, scale them up, coordinate them better, there really is an opportunity to make a collective effort to ensure digital inclusion across the board. So this is where the Secretary General proposes, for instance, a multi-stakeholder digital inclusion coalition that will take forward a lot of this work. He also talks about, again, the need for matrices, the idea of measurement and holding accountable this effort towards ensuring digital inclusion. He talks about the need to promote public-private partnerships, as well as to fund detailed data collection initiatives. Again, in the United Nations system, if it isn't measured, it's not being done, and we don't really know what's going on. So here, again, we put a lot of emphasis on the idea of development of matrices and on measurement and data collection, and subsequently doing something about the data. We also here emphasize all the various groups that that I've mentioned before, the need to, for instance, apply a gender lens at the same time to pay greater attention to the situation of people on the move. And this is why we're particularly heartened by the work of a lot of the agencies to really, again, look at how digital inclusion and connectivity really impacts the work of, for instance, the humanitarian agencies or those who are responding to emergencies as well. So that would be the aspect of ensuring digital inclusion. The fourth area is digital capacity building. And this is really an area where, again, we recognize the fact that there are many UN agencies that are working in this area. They are doing amazing work, but there needs to be a better way to coordinate, scale up, and bring us all together such that member states who have this demonstrated need for digital skills and digital capacity building know where in the UN system, and not even just the UN system, the broader digital ecosystem, they can turn to get these resources and help and technical assistance they need. So this is where, in the Secretary General's roadmap, for instance, we stress that digital capacity building has to be more needs-driven and tailored to individual and national circumstances, and there has to be a better coordination globally. In terms of this, we talk about, for instance, the need to map existing digital capacity building initiatives, as well as use these to expand on that, to have detailed need assessments for the countries. There is also a proposal in the Secretary General's roadmap to create a broad multi-stakeholder network to promote holistic, inclusive approaches to digital capacity building. In essence, we actually want to create a multi-stakeholder network that will serve the function that I talked about earlier, this global coordination on a multi-stakeholder basis, not just UN system, but also private sector companies, NGOs that are also offering this type of capacity building, and find a way to have a clearinghouse function where we match what is being provided with the needs or the requests from member states, so that we can most effectively coordinate the amount of capacity building that is out there and scale it up in such a way that really we can meet the vast need that is really present in a lot of the developing countries and the world writ large. We also talk about how this isn't just the idea of global coordination in a multi-stakeholder sense, but also the idea that within the UN system, we also really need to scale up our efforts to ensure a coordinated approach to capacity building when it comes to digital issues. This is where the Secretary General's roadmap, for instance, stresses the role of the UN country teams through their resident coordinators to serve as in-country focal points of digital cooperation. We are discussing, for instance, we will be discussing with DOCO and relevant parts of the UN system, how we can really lean on the United Nations field presences to really focus on digital cooperation as one aspect of the work. We also talk about, and this is an idea that actually was quite interesting and it was raised by some of the multi-stakeholders in the UN agencies, the possibility of building on the existing United Nations Volunteers Program to create in some ways a United Nations Digital Service Corps where there could be a partnership between UN agencies as well as youths to really support capacity building initiatives nationally that could be focused on, for instance, getting connectivity out to rural areas, building capacity in countries so that they can best use technologies as well. So this is part of the overall effort on digital capacity building. The fifth area in the Secretary General's roadmap, something that is very critical to a lot of what we do, is that of digital human rights. And this is where I think that really the Secretary General's roadmap was quite groundbreaking, that it really set out a very clear statement that human rights apply both online and offline. In a lot of the responses that we've gotten to the roadmap, CSOs, non-governmental organizations, and human rights organizations have really been very heartened by what they see as a strong message by the Secretary General in the roadmap on the importance of digital human rights and this recognition that a lot of these key issues that are now being raised when it comes to human rights protection online really have to be addressed by the United Nations, and that the United Nations needs to play a role in sort of staking out ground and say it's fundamentally important that we address human rights. And this is where you'll see the Secretary General's roadmap calls for member states to place human rights at the center of regulatory frameworks and their legislation in digital technologies, and also commits the United Nations system to lead by example. So for instance, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights will be working on, for instance, a system-wide review, putting forward human rights due diligence guidelines. This is also coming out of the Secretary General's call for action, human rights, and a lot of the ongoing discussions where the Secretary General's roadmap really gives this priority and says that this is something that the United Nations system will be doing. The roadmap itself also highlights key areas and key concerns for the Secretary General in terms of data protection and privacy, digital identity, the use of surveillance technologies, internet shutdowns, online violence and harassment. And so all these areas are part of this collective effort, I think, to really put these human rights issues at the forefront of our engagement in the digital domain. I'll leave you to read the roadmap. And again, this is a teaser and an advertisement for you to read the roadmap if you want to go into some of the details of what we actually say on digital human rights. But you'll see on the page right now that there really are a lot of key areas that we are looking to encourage further action on. And in particular, we're also talking about the need to encourage technology companies and the private sector to really also put human rights at the forefront of what they do. So that's on digital human rights and ensuring the protection of human rights. Artificial intelligence is the sixth area that's mentioned in the roadmap. And this is where, for instance, there's been a lot of discussion internationally about what should be done when it comes to artificial intelligence. And the key recommendation in this particular area of artificial intelligence from the Secretary General is that the United Nations can serve as a platform to bring together these global discussions on AI, precisely because we recognize that there have been so many initiatives by countries, by technical institutions, by multi-stakeholder coalitions to talk about AI issues, but there really is no sort of universal platform that brings this all together. And what is particularly stout in a lot of these discussions on artificial intelligence is that the global south and developing countries are not often at the table, that their voice is not clearly heard when it comes to artificial intelligence issues. But in many ways, AI has the potential to make the most impact on how they and their societies function. So as a result, there is a critical need to ensure representation of the global south. And this is part of why the Secretary General puts forward the United Nations as a platform to bring forward these inclusive discussions that would ensure representation from the global south. And so the specific recommendation from the roadmap here is for the creation of a multi-stakeholder advisory body on global AI cooperation, which will help build global capacity for the development and use of AI in a manner that is trustworthy, human rights-based, safe and sustainable, and promotes peace. And here, we've been asked quite a lot of questions about the AI advisory body. And this is why I would say we're actually not there yet. We're in the process of listening to everybody, conducting a major global multi-stakeholder consultation enterprise on what is the best format for this AI advisory body. Is it going to be the typical 34 members on a panel, on a body we meet twice a year and just issue reports? Or can there be a more creative, dynamic way of putting forward some kind of network of networks or some kind of consultative body that would best provide advice to the Secretary General and the United Nations system on the broader issue of AI. And here we're working very closely with UN entities that actually are already active in this area. For instance, UNESCO that is working on the ethics of AI to make sure that their efforts are complementary and really it builds in together into a broader framework where, again, ensuring that there is representation from the global south and that the United Nations itself is sort of leading the global discussions on this particular issue. Here, I also want to emphasize that it is not meant as a normative body. It's not going to substitute for processes that are ongoing, that are looking at the normative aspects of AI governance. What it really aims to do, it really is looking at more of an information sharing, sort of capacity building function, where we can really support, again, the use of AI in a particular manner, and we can harness AI to best support the sustainable development goals. The seventh area that's highlighted in the roadmap is the area of digital trust and security. And this is something that actually has been quite interesting with regards to some of the discussions in the high-level panel. So some of you that might have followed the high-level panel's discussion might remember that at that point in the discussion of the high-level panel, there was a feeling that there really needed to be more of a global statement, not just by member states, but also by the international community, private sector, civil societies, that there is a fundamental lack of security and stability in the digital environment. And as a result, it would be important that everyone commits to having a stable and secure digital environment which would then be critical to the functioning of the online space. So what the Secretary General has done here is that following consultations, we've looked at the importance of the issue of digital trust and security and actually pinned it very clearly to the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, what we've done is we've recognized the importance of digital technologies underpinning core societal functions and infrastructure. For instance, access to food, water, housing, transportation, healthcare, and how this then is fundamental to the achievement of the 2030 agenda itself. And here the Secretary General's roadmap calls for the Secretariat to continue exploring with member states the feasibility of having a global statement that outlines these common values and the importance of a secure digital environment to the achievement of the SDGs. We've also been very clear to hear some of the reservations that have been expressed by member states, whereby countries have been concerned that there might be possible overlap with ongoing United Nations processes, such as the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts. And this is why we've moved away from this idea of it purely being about cybersecurity, but really to emphasize the development, sustainable development, capacity building angle, and sort of looking at how digital trust and security is fundamental to the SDGs as opposed to more technical cyber attacks related issues. And so this is why the Secretary General is committed to continuing this conversation with member states to see whether there is this wish for a universal statement on digital trust and security, also recognizing the fact that after member states have actually agreed on this statement would be unique because it would be open to not just governments, but also the private sector, the tech companies, civil society also pledge themselves to this common vision of how we see technology as being fundamental to achieving the SDGs. So this is a continuing conversation that our office will be embarking on in the next few months as follow-up to the roadmap. The final area in the Secretary General's roadmap, and I'm so sorry for taking so much time to go over the entire report, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the recommendation so that even if you don't read it, you'll have a sense of what is contained in the roadmap itself and sort of the future work of the office and the Secretary General's priorities when it comes to digital cooperation. The last area is this idea of global digital cooperation and the architecture that surrounds digital cooperation internationally. The idea here is that in the high-level panel, they suggested a number of models for how we should structure the governance frameworks for digital cooperation issues. Discussions on that are a little bit ongoing, and I think there is a recognition that this is a much more complex issue that can actually be solved via one report or even very quickly. So I think discussions on this will continue to evolve, and that a lot of countries and stakeholders will continue to sort of move in this space. But what was very clear from the discussions and the consultations that we've had on this issue is that one, countries, stakeholders, and all of those who have been engaged in this process feel that the Internet Governance Forum is important and has to be strengthened and enhanced. And so, for instance, the Secretary General's roadmap lays out very concrete areas and proposals where he intends to strengthen the IGF itself. So our office is working very closely with DESA to look at these proposals, to work with the interested Geneva communities as well, to bring forward these specific proposals on how to strengthen the Internet Governance Forum. What is also very relevant for colleagues around the table and colleagues listening in terms of the UN system is that the Secretary General's roadmap also stresses the importance of the UN system itself pulling its weight and really better looking at how it can harness technology to fulfill its mandates better. There have been a lot of initiatives from across the system, and really the roadmap is meant to encourage this effort to better harness technology and to look at digital cooperation really as a key aspect of the work of all agencies. He also, in his roadmap, indicates his intention to appoint an envoy on technology sometime next year. And this person, this envoy on technology, will, I think, help to bring together the efforts of the UN system when it comes to digital cooperation, as well as serve as a focal point for external parties, for member states, for tech companies to really dock with the UN system and build the partnerships that are necessary for us to carry forward digital cooperation. That is essentially, I think, more or less a key summary of the elements in the roadmap. I'm happy to go into details to explain some of the processes and to take any questions. And I would really like to hear all colleagues' views on what you see as important, what you saw as valuable, or any reflections that you might have on the roadmap and how we can continue our office's work. Thank you so much, Joanna.
Thank you, Yuping. What a wonderful presentation. Really, really good to see some of the incredible work that has gone into developing this roadmap and the really excellent recommendations to really ensure that everyone has safe and reliable and affordable access to the internet, the opportunities that come with it, and promote digital cooperation. So massive congrats to you and the team for putting this together. This cannot have been an easy year for you. I really appreciate it. I've seen a lot of questions coming in, and encouraging again everyone to please pop them in the Q&A box. And also you can vote on questions there. So if anything captures your attention, give it a like, make sure it gets bumped up in the queue so that we can prioritize the questions that are of most relevant to everyone. We always try and like to give the floor a little bit to our question askers. And I'm going to hand the floor to Kat from DOCO, who already said that she would love to collaborate and has a question for you, Yuping. Kat, you should be able to unmute yourself in case you'd like to ask the question yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, hi Yuping, thank you so much for that very comprehensive and yet somehow concise presentation. So congratulations on this milestone. This is really exciting. I only joined the new DCO, the Development Cooperation Office, late last October. So perhaps I missed some connections there. But it'd be great to hear how you're also mobilizing support within the UN system at the country level. Have you engaged? Are you working in any particular countries or having dialogues with specific governments? Are there, and I'm thinking of this also because, you know, as the sort of coordinator of the resident coordinator system, of the RC system, you know, we're constantly receiving competing demands for different, you know, directives from HQ to our RCs, and so there's always it's a highly competitive environment for the attention of the RC. So it would be good to know where we have some inroads in particular countries or particular countries that you're focusing on in terms of prioritization, and generally how you're mobilizing the system, the UN entities, you know, who's leading on what. And then I was just typing in another question into the Q&A, so if you will permit me, I had a last question about how this is relating to our own digital transformation strategy within the UN, because there is I think you talked about a kind of, you know, groups that are potentially left behind. I think within the system as well, there are generational differences, let's call them, among other kind of divides, and how we approach, you know, work on digital cooperation and our own sort of culture around technology and digital transformation that I think will also be somewhat of an obstacle, kind of bringing our colleagues, our staff, our workforce along with us on this journey into into this future of digital cooperation. So any reflections you have on my barrage of questions would be most welcome. Thank you so much. And thanks, Johanna, for the chance to speak up. Over.
Thank you, Kat. And the barrage of questions for you, Yuping. Any reflections?
I'll try my best. Sure. On the first question, the extent to which we've actually worked with the UN's presence in country, to be very honest, we actually have not. Because this office, my office, is actually very new, and we've actually been mostly focused on the follow-up to the high-level panel and putting together the roadmap. So we actually haven't started this process of reaching out to the in-country presence. And this is why I sort of mentioned the fact that we're really hoping to work with your office. And I really welcome your offer to collaborate with us, because we will be leaning on you to sort of help us in terms of navigating the space with the UN's country presence and sort of identifying where you think there are these types of avenues. So in the Secretary General's roadmap, I think it's more an ambition as opposed to sort of saying that it's already been done. Hochschild likes to quote a UAE colleague of ours that said, we now have the roadmap and the challenge is to build the road to get us there. And so part of that process of building the road is having these partnerships with DOCO and other parts of the UN system to see how best we can leverage what's going on. I will say, however, that there has been some interest from a lot of member states on this, and that's precisely why we also think we need to activate the UN country teams and the UN's in-country presence to leverage on the areas where there has been interest shown by the member states to really bring forward the issues of connectivity, inclusion, and capacity building. The example, for instance, that we use sometimes is the fact that in Kazakhstan, there is deep interest in connectivity. And in some ways, Kazakhstan has been a global leader in the Central Asian region when it comes to pushing Central Asian countries forward into the digital arena. And they are very close partners, for instance, with the International Telecommunications Union and UNICEF on the GIGA project. There are also sort of countries where there's been a very strong focus on using digital technologies and specific aspects of them. And we've been partnering with those individual countries, but again, through both the UN entities that work with us, as well as individual countries that have expressed interest. So we're really hoping that through our partnership with DOCO and reaching out to you, we can find a way to scale this up in a more organized and systematic manner. And I think our USG is looking forward to this conversation with your ASG at some point very soon, precisely how we can actually better forge this partnership and take advantage of DOCO's leadership and guidance to the resident coordinator system in taking digital cooperation forward. On the digital transformation strategy, I hear you that, in some ways it's going to be a challenge within the UN system itself. And this is where I'm not sure it's just my office. It's going to be all of us that are interested in technology and digital cooperation and really feel that this is an area that the UN has to work on to take it forward together. We've had, for instance, the Young UN as one of the constituents on our roundtable, and their contribution has been very important. And we're also looking to Young UN colleagues to sort of, in some ways, you're right, lead this charge towards changing mindsets and bringing forward digital transformation within our own system itself.
Thank you, Ping. And I'm going to pass on the shout out to our colleagues from Young UN. I'm sure they will be thrilled to be seen as agents of change, which indeed they are. There's a bunch of questions coming in there. There's one that I particularly liked from a colleague who preferred not to give their name. It's on capacity building. And the colleague is saying that the technical capacities of societies in the least developed countries are still very low. What is the first step to create more digital inclusion and strengthen the capacities there? What is the UN, or what can the UN do to support these people? And the colleague is saying, for example, creating a program such as the digital capacity building global standard training. So has there been any consideration on that front?
This is where I turn the question back to colleagues, because we are more than excited to partner with you if you have ideas or initiatives that your entities would be willing to sort of take forward. I really want to come back to this idea that we in US Chief Fabrizio's office are very small. And in some ways, what we are doing is sort of, like sounding the bell and saying that these are very important issues. But then when it comes to implementation of these programs and these great ideas that everybody has, we can support you, but really we would be depending on the various UN entities and the agencies and departments to really take forward these ideas. I think your idea for having some kind of workshop or training program on global capacity building is an amazing one. And we'd be happy to work with your agency or entity to work on it. We ourselves don't have the capacity to run these things, but we would be happy to support you, to bring our private sector partners, to create the partnerships and alliances necessary to create these kinds of projects that would have the meaningful impact in the developing countries. This is also partly why the roadmap itself really stresses the need for capacity building, as well as the importance of connectivity, particularly for the 3.6 billion people that still remain offline. So in some ways, we think we've opened the door to really flag these issues, and then it's up to the UN system to respond precisely by embarking on these initiatives. So please feel free to reach out to me in my office, and we'll see what we can do to partner you on this and to give you whatever support you need to try and bring this forward.
Very nice. So this is a joint effort and not something that is driven entirely by Yuping and her team. So it requires all of us to come together to turn these incredible recommendations into practice. So thanks for that. Because you mentioned partners, there's a couple of questions coming in around how to work with partners, some very positive and some also on the critical side. And we have Arinjai here. And is saying this, you sometimes see something like digital colonialism, where, the Facebook's free basics, they're coming in and they have good intention, but they don't always translate quite into that. And Arinjai is wondering if the roadmap aims to strengthen digital governance over private sector and tech companies to avoid such criticism.
That is a tricky question. And I will be very honest and say that, this is sort of very candidly that I would share, that some people have said that the way we say digital cooperation, some people view it as digital governance or global governance of digital issues. But this is, I think, something where the United Nations has to tread carefully, because ultimately we are in service to member states. And I'm not sure that we really can go that space to say we are going to try and govern how countries approach digital issues. So what we really look at is this idea that cooperation is more coming together of all stakeholders to discuss what works best. So a sharing of information, best practices, and along the way, if we can really work towards it, the creation of certain norms or standards or ideas, which will then be the basis for, rather than governance, but at least cooperation and a shared understanding among all the parties. So governance per se, I think, is a tricky issue. And even now, I mean, you don't see countries having the best time trying to govern the technology companies of the private sector. So I'm not really sure it's an ambition that we can aspire to, but the idea of cooperation, at least, is this idea of coming together as a platform to agree on what needs to be done and what is the best way to carry this forward, and hopefully then creating this understanding about what we all collectively need to do in our separate spaces, be it governments, private sector companies, CSOs alike, as part of this collective enterprise. So that's how we see the digital cooperation architecture and the digital cooperation agenda. I will also say that colleagues may have noticed that in recent interviews, the Secretary General really has been emphasizing this idea that the United Nations can serve as a platform to bring everybody together to have these necessary discussions on how to best approach the digital space and to mitigate a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in cyberspace and the digital environment. So the Secretary General, for instance, in his recent Nelson Mandela speech, in his interview with The Economist, talks about how the roadmap really is putting forward this notion of us all coming together to address these key issues in digital cooperation.
Thank you, and I've heard a lot of very good things about that speech, so suggest everyone go and take a look at that. Related to collaborating, or related to private sector partners, and this one is more framed around collaborations, there's a question around protecting people, especially vulnerable people in least developed countries, from things like fake news, hate speech, violence, inciting posts, propaganda, etc. And the colleague who preferred not to share their name is wondering if there is any work towards a global social media if there's any work towards practical measures to ensure that news are verified and work together with these private sector partners to protect vulnerable populations from things like fake news and hate speech.
Again, I think we agree that it's a critical area. We are not, as our office, sort of in the lead on those issues, but we are happy to work with DGC colleagues or other colleagues to bring it forward. And this is where we hope that SecGen's roadmap, for instance, very clearly flagposts these issues as key areas that we want to address. So the Secretary General's roadmap, for instance, really does talk about the need for content governance, the responsibility of technology companies to actually address a lot of these issues. And in some ways, we're quite humble about our ambitions. We can't be the ones that do this, and we are trying to work with other parts of the UN system and technology companies to bring forward these aspects to address precisely the issues that you've raised. So for instance, our office is looking at strengthening our work with OHCHR on the digital human rights piece to address content governance, to actually forge some kind of campaign partnership with both civil society as well as tech companies on the issue of online harassment and online gender-based violence. So there are areas where I definitely think that UN can play more of a role, and we are happy to work with all partners on this. And the tech companies, luckily for us, have been very open actually to this idea of partnership on these aspects. I don't know, I mean, quite frankly, some of them have gotten quite a lot of bad press in recent months for other types of activities, but this is an area where I think there can be some scope for activities on specific areas where we as the UN could play a leading role in partnership with the technology companies to bring this forward.
Thank you. And again, the call for collaboration stands out there. And I want to give you a question from Gabriel from PAHO, I believe the South American arm of the World Health Organization. And he's asking, how can other organizations participate in this? So can we just spell it out again? If someone wants to be part of driving these recommendations, do they just reach out to you? Do they put their arm up and saying, I'm going to lead one of them? What's your process for finding partners and taking this forward?
We're very inclusive. We're really quite big on making this process as inclusive as possible. So I would encourage everybody to email me, and then I'll see how best we can have a discussion about where you want to be engaged on, which roundtables or issues interest you, what are the areas that you're already working in and you'd like to be sort of involved in those discussions. I will say also that a lot of the work of the roundtables will be carried forward by individual UN agencies. So I mentioned, for instance, ITU, UNICEF. UNDP is also a lead agency that is leading on one of our roundtables. We also have very strong partnerships with UN Women, OHCHR, and so forth. So in some ways, it won't just be our office. It'll also be us trying to find you the best partner for what you're interested in, what you're already engaged in, and how best we can leverage on the joint synergies between our work and yours. So in summary, please feel free to reach out anytime, and we'll figure out the best way to connect you as part of the implementation process, to find you the right partners who can help amplify the work that you're doing and really build on that as part of a collective effort in terms of taking forward the roadmap.
Thank you very much. Coming to a question from Mark West from UNESCO, and he's saying, first of all, he's saying excellent presentation, and I've seen that in the chat as well, so passing the compliments on again to you, and great job fielding so many questions here from our side. And Mark is wondering why AI got its own heading recommendation in the report when the other recommendations and headings were more about aspects like inclusion, human rights, etc. So what was the rationale for making AI a specific subsection?
It was interesting. The high-level panel actually flagged AI, and then it had a specific recommendation on AI. And what was funny was that after we published the high-level panel report, and we actually sent, sort of a reach out to a lot of the stakeholders and the member states that had been involved in the process, and sort of said, in terms of the follow-up, which is the area that you'd be most interested in taking up, and where do you think there is the most potential or most scope for the UN to do something? AI, artificial intelligence, really came back as the #1 most popular. Everybody wants to be involved in this particular area. And that, I think, is sort of symbolizes the interest that people have in artificial intelligence, really as both an enabler of development, enabler of progress, but at the same time, the concern that when it comes to AI, really, this is at the forefront of technologies that we really need to get a global grip on. So I think that in recognition of that and that global interest that was around artificial intelligence, that's why AI had to be sort of a standalone part of the roadmap. And here, again, we are quite realistic in our ambitions for AI. So you'll see that the roadmap doesn't really lay out key principles for AI or how AI should be governed or specific aspects when it comes to AI. Rather, it's a recognition that the conversation needs to continue, and it offers the Secretary General's Aegis and the United Nations as a platform to have these continuing discussions. And here I also want to give a shout out to UNESCO for really being very close partners with our office when it comes to that specific recommendation and taking the process forward as well. So UNESCO has been a key champion on the specific roundtable that discussed the AI issue and will be a close partner as we go forward in the creation of the AI advisory body. And the important work that UNESCO is doing now, for instance, on AI ethics will be a key milestone as the United Nations sort of gels together around this idea of how best do we approach AI. And the Secretary General's advisory body on AI will be a means that we can disseminate the important work that UNESCO is doing and put into practice what UNESCO then agrees on in terms, UNESCO and through its process agrees on as the AI, the framework for the ethics of AI.
Thank you very much, and indeed great work from UNESCO on AI. Again, very interesting resources out there. We recommend you read the reports. Our top ranked question, Yiping, comes from Elias. I think he's from UNDP, but I'm not entirely sure. And he's saying the roadmap clearly mentions the difference in connectivity between developed and least developed countries. And he quotes the figure here, 86 versus 19%. And I guess that means that Elias actually read the report. So well done. And he's saying creating connectivity requires a lot of investments, a lot of funding. And often this funding is not available in least developed countries. So this is a big question, but has there been any contemplation around how to provide funding or how to close this funding gap over the next years to provide access to connectivity?
I completely agree with you. So we've seen estimates that say, for instance, the cost of connecting Africa, where less than one third of the population currently has access, is something in the realm of US $100 billion. So if you imagine that that's for Africa, then the scale of connecting the rest of the world will be immensely larger. I mean, I've seen reports that say, broadband connectivity in the US is a crisis. And I keep thinking, what does that mean for the rest of the world when it's a crisis for the US, which is clearly a developed country? And so this issue of funding is really quite foremost. And the Secretary General's roadmap actually has a proposal for the establishment of a financing platform, the convening of a group of investors and finance experts to really explore this issue of connectivity and look at how to fund connectivity and investment and financing models that could work. So this is going to be one of the key outputs, I think, of my office and really working with all UNDP and other parts of the system to see how can we create this partnership of funders and donors. And here again, it doesn't have to be money from the UN system, but sort of calling on what's out there in the private sector, philanthropy, foundations and so forth to really bring forward a coalition to precisely address this issue of funding so that the LDCs will be fully supported in these efforts to actually create global connectivity. So stay tuned, we continue to work closely on this, and this will be, I think, one of the key areas where the UN system really will have to put some walk behind the talk, really financing the needs for global connectivity and finding innovative and creative ways of doing so.
Absolutely. And again, the call for collaboration is loud and clear. And we'll make sure, Yiping, to be sharing your contact details with everyone. So you can expect 150 emails, barrage of questions from Kat and a barrage of emails from all of us interested to collaborate. But hopefully it will make your work easier going forward. I have a question from Ruben for you, and he is from Guatemala, UNICEF in Guatemala, I believe. And he's saying, how can the UN agencies make sure they're aligned with the work of this roadmap to avoid creating silos and ensure that from global to country levels, the UN entities are working in an aligned fashion?
I think this is a challenge, I think, with every report, that there is coordination across the board. And I'll be honest and say, I think it's a challenge. It'll continue to be a challenge. The appointment of the technology envoy is foreseen as having a little bit of a loose coordination role, not, but at least sort of making sure that you're right, left hand knows what right hand is doing. And there's a sense that it all fits within the broader framework of the priorities that have been laid out by the Secretary General in his roadmap. So I hope with the technology envoy is created, this will also some way towards enhancing coordination and coherence within the UN system. And this is also where we are, again, counting on the lead agencies that are really pushing forward the project on connectivity and digital cooperation to sort of make sure that the other parts of the UN system are also fully in tune with what they themselves are doing. So I think, for instance, conversations like this and the effort that UN makes to bring us all together so that we can share information about what we're all doing and the initiatives that we're embarking on is part of this effort for coordination. I would encourage, for instance, and I think, greater efforts to do this, and whether it's via informal networks or more formal channels, I really think that collaboration in the UN system is a must.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to make you work for your morning coffee and try and squeeze in a couple more questions, maybe quick answers so we can clear through a couple of them. And I have Mike Heron here from the World Health Organization, and he is referring to the digital help desks that were part of the high-level panel's report, and wondering if you could speak a little bit more about them.
So in the high-level panel report, we referred to digital help desk, and that kind of morphed a little bit into this idea that we have in the roadmap for digital capacity building. So what we've talked about there is the spirit of the digital help desk, the idea that there has to be greater emphasis on coordination to support national capacity, and this idea that either the best institution for doing so would either be regional sort of institutions or perhaps a more global facility to ensure coordination and coherence. So that's where you'll see in the roadmap, for instance, there is the proposal to establish a multi-stakeholder, I think it's called a network right now, where we would bring together both UN agencies and as well as private sector companies or other stakeholders that are ready to offer support for capacity building in a central location where we can then offer a kind of a matchmaking service of sorts, where countries who need this kind of support know where to go. Again, it's not that there are not good efforts out there when it comes to capacity building, but I think there is a challenge for countries in terms of knowing where to turn to and what is available that they can actually use and leverage on. So the goal here is to bring all these regional capacity building initiatives together and in some ways provide that kind of service, whereby we can actually make sure that those who have a need can then have this met by some type of service providers, not necessarily the United Nations.
Thank you, Yuping, and I hope this answered your question, Mike. The last question, I want to take one from our colleagues from the UN University in Macau, and I believe that's Jingbo and Don Rodney. And I'm going to take that question because those colleagues are probably joining us at 9 p.m. or 9:30 p.m. So thank you for tuning in. And I think it's an important question around next steps. And they are wondering, is there a timeline for the consultation implementation process of the roadmap? So what's going to happen next?
There is no timeline per se, because some of the goals are longer term. I mean, the goal of universal connectivity, I think as another colleague had mentioned, it's going to be a long-term process. And even 10 years, which is the time frame in the roadmap, is not exactly, I'm not even sure that we can actually work towards it. But again, this is an aspiration. So I would say that we don't really have a time frame per se, but what we are looking to do now with our roundtables, as well as the UN agencies that are leading the process, as well as any other partners that are interested, is to create plans of actions, implementation plans for each of the areas of Secretary General's roadmap, with ideas for who are the lead partners, what are the timeframes envisioned, what are the next steps, and put it together in more of a holistic implementation plan for the roadmap itself. So ultimately, there won't be a deadline to say we have to finish it by a certain date, but this will be the first step in creating a concrete plan to take forward these aspects of digital cooperation. This also will be dependent a little bit on the discussions within the roundtables themselves and what the UN entities leading feel about the achievability of certain goals. So for instance, when it comes to the plan to convene a financing body to establish like matrices for affordability and targets and so forth, this will be, I think, quite important to sort of see where the International Telecommunications Union or where other entities are actually embarking on similar initiatives and sort of plug our work as part of that process so that we don't duplicate what's going on, but really we build on what's already existing. We encourage greater efforts and really say that the Secretary General's roadmap gives you in some ways a turbocharge for what you're already doing for you to move these actions forward, because really now you have the whole backing of the Secretary General and in many ways the member states as well, because the reception to the roadmap was universally positive, particularly from developing countries, feel that a lot of these objectives are critical and essential. And they want the UN system to speed up our work in those areas. So we see the roadmap as, again, laying out the vision and setting out where we want to go, but we have to build the road. And the process of building the road is about working with all the agencies to scope what best is doable. But we are now working to actually frame this plan of action, implementation plan for all of the 8 areas.
That's again a fantastic opportunity to bring the best from the UN to help drive this agenda forward. Yuping, I know you're incredibly busy, so I don't want to go over time. We're out of time. I think you did a fantastic job introducing us to an excellent read and some really thought through recommendations. So thank you so much for taking the time to being with us this morning. We really appreciate it. Congrats again to you and the entire team. And I hope this conversation will lead to further collaboration in this field.
Thank you so much. And, again, thanks to you and to Union for allowing me this opportunity to brief. In short, really, we are very open to partnerships and collaboration with the rest of the UN system. We hope you find the Secretary General's roadmap useful in your own work, and feel free to reach out to me in my office at any time.
Thank you. And Yuping, if you could just go to the last slide, which I think has your contact details on, because I'm sure those are going to be jotted down from everyone. And in the meantime, I am posting one last link in the chat, and that is the link to our webinar library. It already has the slides from today's conversation on there, and we'll be adding the recording shortly. So if you would like to recap or look at the slides in more peace and quiet, you can find them there. So thanks again from my side. This has been such a pleasure, such a great start to the day. Thank you for being with us, to you, Yuping, and to everyone online. And we look forward to seeing you take this work forward.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all colleagues for taking 1 hour of your precious time to listen to me talk about the roadmap. And I hope that 75% of you that have not read the roadmap might be inspired enough now to perhaps just give it through very briefly.
I'm sure we will. We'll make sure to share the link again. Thanks everyone, and wishing you a very good day.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.